Today, on this episode of Reflections, I again recognize and celebrate Women's History Month. This episode will be dedicated to two literary icons, Gwendolyn Brooks and Emily Dickinson. I will discuss their life, career, and poetry, which I've been influenced by. Also, I dedicate this episode of Reflections to Sandra Crouch, a noted African American gospel singer. Miss Crouch passed away earlier this week at the age of 81, along with her twin brother, Andre Crouch. She created music for decades, beginning in the 1960s. Miss Crouch won a Grammy in 1984 in the Best Soul Gospel Female category for her album entitled We Sing Praises. On that album, there was a song that I recently discovered called I'm So Glad I Got to Know You, detailing her relationship with Christ. I saw a performance from the 1984 Dove Awards, which is now one of my favorite performances. So thank you again for joining, listening, and watching as I reflect. Again, welcome to Reflections. I'm your host, Deontay Brewer. As I stated earlier, we will be talking about two literary icons, Gwendolyn Brooks and Emily Dickinson. Gwendolyn Brooks was born in 1917 in Topeka, Kansas. She was an African American poet based in Chicago, Illinois. Brooks began writing poetry as a child, publishing her first poem at the age of 13, entitled Eventide. By high school, her poems were being published in Chicago's black newspaper, the Chicago Defender. After attending college and working for the NAACP, or the National Advancement for Colored People, Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Brooks continued developing her craft for poetry, publishing her first collection of poems in 1945 entitled A Street in Bronzeville. A Street in Bronzeville was published by Harper and Brothers. Brooks became the first African American woman to win literature's top honor, the Pulitzer Prize, in 1950 for her collection of poems entitled Annie Allen. Brooks wrote of Annie Allen from girlhood to adulthood, detailing significant events in Annie's life, such as her relationship with her parents, life at school, and her marriage. Here's an excerpt from Annie Allen. Maxie Allen always taught her stipendiary little daughter to thank her Lord and lucky star for eye that let her see so far, for throat enabling her to eat her Quaker oats and cream of wheat, for tongue to tantrum for the penny, for ear to hear that haven't any, for arm to toss, for leg to chance, for heart to hanker for romance. So as you can see, Brooks had she had a talent for words and putting words together. And to me, this Maxie Allen was Annie Allen's mother. And the poem is saying that Maxie taught Annie to thank God and, to acknowledge that she's lucky and to see and understand that she's been blessed. She's able to eat, and because there's a reference to Quaker oats, and for tongue to tantrum for the penny, that she's able to make a wage for herself, use her tongue to talk and whatever her vocation is or job, and to even argue, to know her worth and argue for her wage. And it says, for ear to hear that haven't any, to be compassionate, to listen to the less fortunate. So Maxie's teaching Annie to be compassionate, for arm to toss, for leg to chance. So to go out and get what you want. And then for heart to hanker for romance. To teach her, she has a heart, to be wise in using that heart, whether it's to obtain a mate or when it comes to making life choices, to be led by your heart. And so I I first heard of Gwendolyn Brooks in school. I was in about the seventh grade, and I remember that there were magazines, Jet and Ebony magazine, and they would always show a file photo of Miss Brooks. And a file photo is a photo that's used in lots of different publications. And I think by that time she was, maybe in her 50s. And so I knew I'd heard about Annie Allen, which I just read the excerpt from. I wanted to know more about her. And so, discovering her in seventh grade, my class and I read a poem by her entitled We Real Cool. And this poem really struck me because I was about 13 at the time and, a young teenager. And its message, is a warning not only to teenagers, but to people as they age in life and the choices that they make. So I'm going to read the poem. It's entitled We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. And its subtitle is The Pool Players. So this poem was about pool players, 7 of them at the Golden Shovel. Okay? So it starts, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight. We sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. And so it's very self-explanatory. This poem is about 7 boys or 7 young men who are good friends, and they hang out at this pool hall. And they think they're really cool, because they have left school. And lurking late means they stay out all night. And it says we strike straight. So maybe their conversation is very direct, and we sing sin, meaning they're always, their activities are always sinister, or they're always, they're motivated, by doing things that aren't right. We thin gin, meaning they drink, they like to drink. And we jazz June, they're always partying and hanging out. And then ultimately, we die soon. They die because of the choices and activities that they've made, with their life. And so as a 13-year-old, that poem really struck me and motivated me to live a life, motivated by the right choices, because I didn't want to end up, like these pool players in Brooks's poem. And so her poems are celebrated as she devotes small, carefully cerebrated terse portraits of the Black urban poor. And so that was quoted in Modern Black Poets, which is a collection of critical essays that was published by Prentice Hall in 1973. So Brooks' poems, there's small, carefully cerebrated terse portraits. So whether she's writing about Annie Allen or whether she's writing about the guys in We Real Cool, they're poems about the Black urban poor. And, Brooks was very much inspired by where she lived in Chicago, by her neighborhood and the conversations that she heard people having when she was out, in the neighborhood shopping maybe, or when she was visiting with neighbors. She used those conversations and created poems, based off of those conversations. And so just a very talented lady. She was married to, his name was Henry Blakely, and he also was an artist. And I believe he may have been a poet as well, but together they both congregated, or should I say they, what's the word I want to use? They hung out. Their friends were Chicago's black middle class professionals and artistic individuals. And Brooks was also the mother of two children, Henry Jr. and Nora. And Nora has she's written poems and things based off of her mother's work. So she's written essays and stuff off of her mother's work. And so Miss Brooks was actually just a accomplished, intelligent, black lady, and I was very much moved by her winning the Pulitzer Prize, for Annie Allen. And I remember when I was younger, wanting to read Annie Allen, and so. By the 1960s, the late 1960s, should I say, her poems began to take on an intense awareness of the problems of color and justice. So she very much, by that time, she had reached middle age, and, her poems were still, celebrating portraits of the black urban poor, but her poems became more political too. And the front cover of this book, you see her at her typewriter, and I believe this was the early 1950s, and she has, she'd permed her hair, and she looked very professional. But by the late 1960s, she had, stopped perming her hair, which, she let her hair grow out into an afro, and she just became very political and advocating even more for the black, the African American race, and the middle class and the urban poor, class. And so I'm going to read, it's entitled Malcolm X by Gwendolyn Brooks. And she says, Ms. Brooks says that this is for Dudley Randall. Original, ragged, round, rich, robust. He had the hawk man's eyes. We gasped. We saw the maleness raking out and making guttural the air and pushing us to walls. And in a soft and fundamental hour, a sorcery devout and vertical beguiled the world. He opened us, who was a key, who was a man. And so this is a very strong portrayal of Malcolm X. She said that he had Hawkman's eyes, meaning, his eyes were very intense. And, I've read other people say that about Malcolm X. And, she's saying that, when I say we, Black America, when we saw and heard Malcolm X, we gasped. We were so astonished and amazed, at his realness. And she says, we saw the maleness raking out and making guttural the air. Guttural is like a piercing cry or sound. And so, and pushing us to walls. Malcolm X, and what she's saying is he forced us and faced us to see the problem, that America was having, the problem with black and white. How African Americans were being oppressed, how we'd been oppressed, for, at that time, almost 400 years, by, white society, by Europeans. And she says, and in a soft and fundamental hour, a sorcery devout and vertical beguiled the world. So she's saying his image, him being upstanding, it beguiled the world wherever he went. He spread his message, whether people liked it or not. He was going to speak the truth, what he felt the truth was, as far as relationships, societal and cultural relationships between black and white. And she says he opened us, who was a key. He opened us. He allowed us to see. He gave us that knowledge and allowed us to see, what was wrong, how we were being oppressed by white society and, European society. And, most blacks became different in their thoughts and actions and behaviors, once they, towards, Europeans, once they realized that they had been oppressed, blacks began to assert their rights and demand their rights and understand that we were not second-class citizens, that we were entitled to have the same things as Europeans and as whites. And so, this is a very moving, strong portrayal that Ms. Brooks wrote about. Then the poem was entitled Malcolm X. And she just had such a way with words, and it was very imagery, strong imagery, and as her career progressed, she wrote 2 autobiographies of herself entitled Report from Part 1. And Report from Part 1 detailed her life, as a young girl up until, she was maybe in her 40s, and then Report from Part 2 continued from like her 40s until I believe she was in her 60s or so, because Report from Part 1 was published, I believe, in 1972. And then Report from Part 2 was published in 1974. She published both of those. So what I like about Ms. Brooks is she, in that instance, she wrote her own autobiographies about herself. She firsthand had lived her life. And, every thought and every behavior and every emotion, her growing up with her family and going to school and beginning to publish poems, at the age of 13, and then having, writing her first poem and having it published at 13, and then at 17, having the Chicago Defender publish it, and then winning the Pulitzer Prize for Annie Allen. She was able to chronicle all of that in those autobiographies. She didn't wait for someone else to tell her story, or she didn't want someone else to tell her story. She told her own story. She was in charge of her own story. And so that's, one of the things I also like about her. She published Report from Part 1 and Report from Part 2. And she also taught at, area Chicago colleges. I mean, who better to be a professor, in writing, in English literature, than a poet, a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. So she was more than, should I say, qualified. Those students were very beneficial to have her as their professor. I stated, yes, she was her personal life. She was married, to Henry Blakely, and had 2 children, Henry Jr. and Nora. Her, born in Topeka, Kansas, she and her family moved to Chicago. She was a young girl. She was born in 1917, and they moved to Chicago in the 1920s. I believe she was 8, so about 1925. And so she was very much, her father had wanted to go to medical school, but because of the, prejudiceness, of that time, he only, I think he went to, maybe had 1 year of college, and certainly we know to be a doctor, you have to go to college, for at least 4 years, and then go on whatever area of medicine you specialize in. That's like another 8 years, could be another 10 years. So her father ultimately was a janitor. And her mother, I believe, had some education, but, was a housewife. But her mother and father always encouraged Brooks to, think for herself and to let those creative juices flow, not to be held back, because she was, female and an African-American female, that she could, she could succeed, and that she did. And so Brooks secured the honor of being Poet Laureate or State Poet for Illinois, the state she resided in for 32 years. And sadly, she died December 3rd of 2000. And so her work is celebrated as bridging the gap between the academic poets of her generation in the 1940s and the young black militant writers of the 1960s. And so, I mean, just her work was so prolific that it spanned time periods. That's a great author and writer and poet. When you can, what's the word I want to use? You can be very prolific in different, you can write in your voice, her words, were prolific in the 40s and 50s, and 60s and 70s. And so that's the mark of a great writer and author and poet. So rest in peace to Ms. Brooks. The second poet I am going to discuss is Emily Dickinson. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born December 10th, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. Dickinson was educated at an early age, first at the Amherst Academy from 1840 to 1847, so about from the age of 10 to 17. And then she attended Mount Holyoke College from 1847 to 1848. And major themes within her work include death and immortality. Immortality is living forever. Dickinson came from a family. Her father was very active in Amherst society. I believe at the college, Amherst College, I believe he was like treasurer of that college. And he also politically had an office, I believe, during, Dickinson's, younger years. He was an officer at the college and he was active in politics. Her mother was a stay-at-home wife and mother, and Dickinson didn't have a close relationship with her mother, but her father encouraged his children to learn and to think. And I read something, her father, it was a quote, and he says, he encouraged her to read, but, he says, don't let, what you learn joggle your mind. In other words, Dickinson was reading, books, and she was thinking for herself as a young person, a young girl, a young woman. But the attitude of that day was that girls and especially unmarried girls or unmarried women, they were under the control of their fathers, and men didn't want women to forget that, and so it was a very patriarchal society, and so. He encouraged her to learn and think, but he wanted her to understand that the ideals, those patriarchal ideals, were commonplace, and they should not be rejected, that they should be followed. And so I have a couple favorite poems by her. One is called or entitled, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. And the other is The Soul Selects Her Own Society. And so I'm going to read those poems. Okay, 60. The first poem is on page 62. Oh, okay. So I don't have the full poem. I don't have the full poem in this book, and it's my error because I should have written the poem down. But the poem was very simplistic. She was also very much influenced by nature, and hearing, when she died, she, could hear a fly buzz. And we know that flies are very quiet. I mean, you can see a fly, but you necessarily can't hear it when it's flying around. You can maybe hear, you can hear a fly if it's close to you, but you can, if it's from a distance, you can't hear it. And so I was very much amazed that the simplest thing, a fly, buzzing, that Dickinson could incorporate that into her work. The second poem is The Soul Selects Her Own Society. And I'm sure this book is related to her readings on certain things. Her poems, unfortunately, aren't copied in this book, but I know that The Soul Selects Her Own Society was based on Dickinson just felt that a person chooses the person being the soul, chooses whom they associate with or whom they align their life and characteristics and ideals with. And Dickinson was very much an anomaly at that time. She lived, in the 1830s. She died in 1886. But as I stated earlier, women, were wives and mothers, and she was neither. She lived at home. She lived in her father's home her whole life, and she wrote poetry. At that time, though, during her lifetime, people didn't know, that she was a poet. She wrote in private, in secrecy, writing at night, when she would stash those poems. Matter of fact, the poems were found in her room under her bed. They were bound by ribbon, but I was just very much, amazed by that she was neither a wife or a mother. And she wrote for a living, and she had her own mind. She was a recluse. She, didn't leave her family's home. She wore white all the time and didn't leave their home. And her only companion outside of her family was a dog. She had a Newfoundland dog named Carlo. And Dickinson had experienced a lot of trauma in her life. She had friends, female friends that had died as a young, when she was a young student. Girls that she had met in school, they'd passed away. And, there were mentors. I know Thomas Wentworth Higginson was a mentor of hers. And he died, and there was another gentleman. He was a young minister. He had died, and so people that she cared about died. She had a lot of loss in her life, and she internalized that grief. And it's been said that those two men really meant a lot to her. They were not only mentors, and when I say mentors, they encouraged her to write. But I think it's been said that she had some emotional attraction, in a connection towards them. Both of those men were married and had families of their own, but certainly that wouldn't have stopped her from having, being attracted to them. And so there was, she internalized, she had a lot of grief. As I stated, she had friends that died, and it had been written that she, I said she was a recluse, but when she was a young girl and teenager, she socialized with friends and neighbors and went on trips and attended school. But then that stopped when she was about 17 or 18. And, she retreated back to her father's home, and she never left his home. So something had to happen, to her, at the age of 17 or 18, for her to retreat to her father's home and never leave it again. I mean, and when I say she didn't leave it, she obviously went, they had grounds on their house where she tended to their gardens, because she was a big fan of, the garden and flowers, and, she collected flowers. And she, their species, what they were, she, wrote of those flowers, but she didn't go very far from home. And so I always found that, really interesting. I wanted to know more about this lady, why was she the way that she was? And there are a few details, about her. I remember hearing about her for the first time. I was in the 11th grade, and I had to write a research paper on her. And at that time, as an 11th grader, I was so about 17, and so I was experiencing teenage angst. When all that comes along with teenage angst, and angst is emotions, and usually they're negative emotions. And I never did finish that paper. I had started it, but I didn't finish it. And but I was very much struck by the picture of her. And there is a picture of Dickinson, the only one of her. It's on the cover of this book, but the only one of her ever published. And she looked very sad. She looked like she was maybe a teenager, and she was very sad, and she very much could have been affected, by those deaths around her. She had a friend named Abaya Root. That was another female that had died, and of an illness. And so I just wanted to know what made this lady so sad, And so subsequently, there have been other works, films. When I say other works, there's been some films that have come out about her life in recent years. She was one of 3 siblings. She had an elder brother named Austin and a younger sister named Lavinia, who they called Vinnie. And Austin married a lady named Susan Gilbert. And Austin, when he got married, he moved next door to their family home. And so Emily was very much attached to Austin's wife, Susan. And they were friends, and it has been said, it has been inferred as you read more of Emily's letters to Susan and the poetry to Susan, that Emily may have had an attraction to Susan Gilbert as well. And so certainly that turned the literary world, and that's been said now for some years, but in recent years, that has, films have made that to be the subject of the film. And so Emily was very complex as a person, as we all are, And so I've read that one of Austin's sons died. His name was Gilbert, and he died in 1871. He was 10 years old, and so Emily took his death really hard. She was very fond of her nephew when, she'd written a poem about his life after he died. And so it was also said children. She loved children very much. And she would, greet children from her window, because I stated, she didn't leave her home very much. And so she would greet them from her window, when she would send down, cookies, she would, send them down, through rope or whatever. And kids would get the cookies, and she baked. She was a baker and cook for the house, for her house. They had a couple servants, but she liked to bake. And so Dickinson just was a talented lady, not only a poet, but, a baker, and, just very complex. And I was just moved by that, moved by her life. She died in 1886 of Bright's disease, which is a disease that affects the kidneys, kidney disease. And she had instructed that, anything that was found, letters and things, be burned, that they be burned. But her sister Lavinia found her poems, under her bed. And so her sister ended up getting those poems published. They were transcribed because Dickinson had a way of writing. She used a lot of dashes, in her poetry. And, it was just that to the literary world, her grammar was it could be confusing or unnecessary, but that was the way she heard, the poetry in her head. And so she used the dashes. Dashes usually, it's a break or space in thought. That's what a dash indicates. And so they had to be edited. A lot of people edited, or the first book of poetry, I think, was published in the early 1900s, and it was edited, and unfortunately, sometimes when works are edited, it's for different reasons. And so, but I'm glad that her sister did not burn that poetry and that it was published, because the world would have lost the talent of a special, lady. And so I dedicate this episode of Reflections to Gwendolyn Brooks and Emily Dickinson, because the literary world, would never be the same. Their observations and poems on life, it was a peek, into the window of their lives. Those of us that, admire their work, and people that study poetry and, all over the world, they gave us a glimpse into their lives. And for that, I'm forever grateful, and so are lots of other fans of poetry and of the written word. So thank you so much to my audience for sharing, for commenting, for watching and listening. And remember to be always to be bold, to be you, and to be blessed. God bless.